What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how I polish epoxy, bringing it up from 80 grit to a perfectly crystal clear finish. This is a really cool ocean themed board that I made, and for this you want perfect clarity. Alright, so a lot of people are getting into these epoxy projects. They're making a lot of these charcuterie boards. This is one that I'm working on here. It's actually got sand and waves in it. Today we're going to be polishing this board, bringing it all the way from 150 grit all the way to a crystal clear polish that looks just as good as a flood coat. It's kind of a cool process. It's not too complicated. It just takes a little bit of time. For this, we are going to be using the Festool ETS EC125 random orbit sander. We're going to be doing 99% of the work with this, and then we'll be using another tool at the end to finish it off. If you're going to be making a project that comes in contact with water, like a charcuterie board, use a spray bottle and raise the grain. So while our water pop is drying, I'll show you what we have going on over here. This is 220 grit and this is 3000 grit. So we have every sandpaper from 220 all the way to 3000. We're going to be sanding the epoxy all the way up to 3000 grit. And it's a little bit of a time-consuming process, but it comes out really neat, and I'll kind of show you how I do that. All right, so I just finished up with the 220, and of course the epoxy looks very much the same. You really don't start to notice a change, at least from my experience, until you get to 1000, 1200, 1500 grit. That's when you really start seeing a change, but it is super important to use all of the grits and go in order. So now that I'm done with the 220, I'm going to throw on the 320 and do the exact same thing that I just did. And the 320 is done, so now it's time for the 400. So you can see, even after that 400, it's looking a lot better than it did when we started, and the board is really, really nice and smooth. Once I get past the 400 grit, I really stop focusing on the wood, and I really only focus on the epoxy. Wood sanded up to 400 grit feels very similar to wood that is sanded to 3000 grit, so I usually don't waste my time clogging up my sandpaper on the wood. I just try and hit all of the epoxy. All right, so the 600 grit is down, and it's important to note I usually only sand one board per piece of sandpaper. It does wear out pretty fast and clog when it's that fine. So I usually just throw away the piece of sandpaper after I'm done doing the board. All right, so I just finished up with the 1200 grit. You can see this is looking fantastic. It's starting to become a lot clearer what's down inside. So now that the 1200 is done, we'll get the 1500 on there and we'll keep on rolling. All right, I just did the 1500 grit. Clarity is really coming back, and this is going to be a gorgeous board. All right, so I just did the 2000 grit sandpaper, and this thing is feeling incredible. Our last sandpaper, our traditional sandpaper, is going to be this 3000 grit. If you've ever felt 3000 grit sandpaper, it is pretty interesting because it's not rough, it is smooth, and it's actually quite smooth. But that's the last grit, and so after we do this, I'll show you what we're gonna do. This 3000 grit should go pretty quick. All right, so the 3000 grit is done, and this thing is looking really, really nice. That wave down in there is really, really incredible looking. I'll have to show you guys in another video how I do that technique, but once you do that 3000 grit, you almost have 100% clarity. It looks fantastic. So I'm gonna set this off to the side. I've got a couple more boards to sand, and then I'm gonna show you what we do to get this thing even better. All right, so aside from finishing, the second to final step is polishing. So what I've got here is the Festool polishing compound. It's the orange one, which seems to work pretty good for me. I've got just a cheap Harbor Freight buffer with the orange pad. I've got a couple different pads. This one seems to be a good all-around pad. So once we sand to 3000, we're gonna buff this. Now, I really only focus on the epoxy, but if you're using a wood like walnut, which is dark, that's gonna contrast with the white polishing compound, I will go ahead and kind of swirl the buffer over top of the wood just to make it look nice and uniform. So usually what I do is put a little drop on the epoxy about the size of a blueberry, and then I just start going to town with the buffer, and it comes out really, really nice. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and put a little pea-sized drop here, maybe do a couple over here of the compound, and we'll start buffing. All right, so you can see I just finished up the first round of buffing, and it looks really, really good. I would have to say it's pretty darn near 100%, and that's hard to achieve, especially with a flood coat when you've got a lot of different factors like bugs and dust and stuff falling in your flood coat, and it's just a giant pain. So in my opinion, polishing the epoxy is far superior. I'm going to go ahead and get some oil and beeswax on this, and then I'll show you guys what the final product looks like. I think it's going to be pretty awesome. All right, so here is the final product. Check out that reflection and the clarity. I mean, it is almost perfect. Thanks for watching.